Hi all, Rick here, looking into the history and lore of the enigmatic First Federation. The First Federation, while benign and open to diplomatic connections with the United Federation of Planets, has its own history steeped in conflict and fear. Their homeworld was known as Fesarius, an M-class planet, and it was the origin of a species called the DECA. These are the tall, bluish-grey aliens witnessed as Balok's puppet, and later on in Star Trek Lower Decks. These aliens were not overly intelligent, but very physically imposing and capable. However, over time, a genetic offshoot or mutation emerged termed the Linic. These were known as a neotenuous species, meaning that their growth from adolescence was delayed, giving them a childlike appearance. However, their minds were far sharper than the DECA. The DECA, however, were easily able to overpower their diminutive cousins and force them into servitude, and they achieved warp flight around 12,000 years before their appearance in the original series. Spreading out, they began colonization efforts, while encountering other nearby interstellar cultures, like the Bogosrin, Tessegri, the Veashol, the Felesti, Saja, and the Neotoko. It seems that the Linic and DECA were the first in the local area to achieve an interstellar state, and as the most advanced, they were able to subjugate many others. However, the Linic were far more compassionate to those the DECA sought to enslave, and secretly provided technology and incited resistance. Eventually, a rebellion rose among the others, and the DECA resorted to orbital bombardment and the use of mass drivers to slam comets into rebellious colony worlds, wiping many out. In order to save them, the Linic turned on their masters and unleashed a mutagenic illness into the DECA. This mutation was similar to their own genetic deviations, and it increased the DECA's mental prowess, while reducing their stature and musculature. This sent the DECA into a long period of rebuilding and retreat as they sought a cure to this affliction, halting their war. In the meantime, the alliance against them was formalised with the creation of the First Federation. This was about 9,500 years ago. Thanks to the rampant and brutal destruction of many colony worlds, the First Federation was left with very little real estate on which to rebuild, including the loss of many of its founding members' homeworlds. To combat this, they became excellent in the creation of colonization stations and sites in environments in less than preferable positions. One such was the capital world of Sherelia, a Jovian-style gas giant. Within its cloud layers were 1,000-kilometre floating cities powered by the magnetics of the J-class world. Among these were several other installations containing the manufacture for their massive defensive ships, each named after a lost colony, like Balok's own Fesarius. The Fesarius vessels, of which there were around 17, were very powerful, capable of high warp factors, and most impressively, they had scanning technology far in advance of Starfleet's, capable of scanning an entire starship, including its databases, in seconds. Not only this, but they can then interface and command a target ship's systems with relative ease. While they possessed incredible firepower, or even could simply command a starship to destroy itself, they seldom did so, except in extreme cases to protect themselves. They were also incredibly difficult to accurately scan, and possessed tractor beams of a similar magnitude to the Borgs. But thanks to the diminutive stature and slow rate of reproduction of the Linic, these massive starships were highly automated, and although they possessed incredible technology, they were still vulnerable. This led to the First Federation creating a number of warning buoys and patrolling the far fringes of First Federation territory, intercepting any interloper immediately. These warning buoys were similarly enigmatic and capable of creating a number of deterrents to prevent entry, including the generation of dangerous radiation levels. However, as an alliance founded on cooperation and the resistance of oppression, they were an otherwise amiable species, as discovered by Captain Kirk and the Enterprise in 2266. Balok, of course, hid behind threats, bluster, and tests to try to intimidate and gauge the intentions of the Starfleet vessel. Upon taking their measure, and as both the first line of defence and representative of the First Federation, Balok was happy to begin the formalities of introductions between the two neighbouring powers. When the DECA located the base of the First Federation in 2269, they attacked it, but it ended in a peace accord, as the Linux began work on fully undoing the thousands-year-old damage to the DECA's genetic code. As for the following relations between these federations, Starfleet still respects the borders of the First Federation space, but delegations, trade and meetings continue to take place either side of the border and across numerous colonies or stations. The First Federation seems to take delight in being able to show off their developments, though they are of course very measured when it comes to sharing their technology. A favoured export, though, is the alcoholic beverage Tranya. In 2286, as the Whale probe was departing the Sol system, its course had it pass through First Federation space, to which Starfleet gave them ample forewarning. The First Federation proceeded to track the probe in real time and openly share its data with both Starfleet and the Romulan Star Empire, when the probe changed course to move towards the neutral zone. It also seemed that the influence of Starfleet seems to have rubbed off on them, as they've recently begun to break out from their tentative defensiveness and launched exploration missions of their own. Another older account says that the First Federation is 50,000 years old, and they were involved in a war with the Orions. Then a cataclysm around 3,600 years ago reduced their influence substantially. But that is the origin of the First Federation, and it has some similarities with the United Federation of Planets. Both were formed in opposition to a dangerous enemy power, and championed the notions of freedom and unity. Each, in its modern interpretation, values continued diplomatic ties, trade, and defence over conquest. The difference is chiefly in the severity of their trauma when being forged. The brutal DECA attacks and destruction led to the First Federation being far more invasive and protective of its own, seldom venturing beyond their borders and even hiding their capital city. In contrast, the UFP has always been one to push the boundaries, explore and experiment where it can, which probably explains the difference in technological development. After all, for a culture over 10,000 years old, the First Federation has not developed as much as expected, with Starfleet rapidly catching up thanks to its approach. I always liked the introduction of the First Federation. It was a breath of fresh air to encounter a friendly interstellar power rather than another new threat in Star Trek, and it stands to me as a good reminder that Starfleet is not the only good guy out there. Helps break down that us versus the universe mentality that sometimes manifests in sci-fi. Thanks for watching this breakdown on the lore of the First Federation. I've been Rick, and until the next one, goodbye.